if he would yield. Senator Booker has joined us. We're happy to have his co-sponsorship of this, and I'm hoping that he might be able to make some of his own observations on the very issue that you are discussing.
Well, I want to pick up right where he left off, and I want to thank, really from the bottom of my heart, the leadership of Senator Lee and Senator Durbin on what I think is an extraordinary piece of legislation in terms of its impact. And you all have made it clear time and time again, as you did in the last Congress and this Congress, that the application of mandatory minimum sentences, especially drug cases, feeds the perception of pervasive unfairness in our criminal justice system, just for the points that Senator Lee was making out. And this perception is based in that reality. When I was mayor, I used to always say, "In God we trust, but everyone else bring me data." And the data is clear from the U.S. Sentencing Commission that shows that mandatory minimums have a disparate impact on minority communities. Let's be clear. The majority of illegal drug users and dealers in our country are white. But 3/4 of all the people incarcerated for drug offenses are Black and Latino. And the large majority of individuals subject to federal mandatory minimum penalties are African American and Hispanic. That perception is fed by this reality. African Americans are granted relief from mandatory minimum penalties, as are other citizens under the so-called safety valve. But Blacks get the safety valve far less than other groups. For example, the data shows in 2010, 63.7% of white offenders received the safety valve relief, while only 39.4% of Black offenders received that benefit. In 2012, Blacks were 26.3% of all drug offenders, just 26.3%, but they were 35.2% of the drug offenders who received no safety valves whatsoever, no relief from the mandatory minimum penalties. And now I want to yield back to Senator Lee, again, the lead sponsor of this bipartisan legislation, and ask him, what does this legislation do specifically to address mandatory minimums?
I thank the senator from New Jersey for this question, which really cuts to the heart of many of the most important reasons why we feel this bill needs to become law. First, the Smarter Sentencing Act would reduce federal mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses in a very targeted way. Our bill would allow federal judges to determine, on a case-by-case basis, when the harshest penalties should apply. We don't repeal any mandatory minimum sentences, and we do not lower any maximum sentences. This approach maintains a floor below which no offenders can be sentenced, but it gives judges the discretion to determine when the very harshest of penalties should apply in a particular case. These changes in mandatory minimum sentences do not apply to violent offenses, and they do not apply to offenders who import drugs into the United States, unless, of course, the offender's role is limited solely to transporting or storing drugs or money. Second, the Smarter Sentencing Act would modestly expand the federal safety valve, which allows federal judges to sentence a limited number of nonviolent drug offenders at levels below the mandatory minimum sentence. Our bill would expand the safety valve to nonviolent offenders with only a minor criminal history. Individuals who use weapons or who play a leadership role in the offense in question would be ineligible for the safety valve in those circumstances. So let me ask the senior senator from Illinois, Mr. Durbin, to explain other important provisions of our bill.
Thanks, Senator Lee. When I was a member of the House of Representatives many years ago, we were told that there was some dramatic changes when it came to narcotics use in America. In fact, they came to us and they said, "We're worried. There's a new form of cocaine called crack cocaine. It is dirt cheap. It's $5 for a hit. It's deadly addictive, and if a woman is addicted to it and happens to be pregnant, it could seriously damage the baby she's carrying." We did something at the time which seemed like the right thing to do. What we did was to establish a sentencing standard for crack cocaine dramatically larger than powder cocaine, dramatically, 100 times larger. I voted for it. And the belief was, we're sending a clear message to anyone in America: you get caught with crack cocaine, we're going to throw the book at you. That's what we voted for. And I remembered that the roll call in the House of Representatives was bipartisan. We felt, all across the spectrum again, let's get the message out and get it out now, before crack cocaine causes its damage. Under the law at the time, it took 100 times more powder cocaine than crack to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentences, 100 times. For example, possessing 5 grams of crack carried the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as selling 500 grams of powder cocaine. That was the 100-to-1 crack powder sentencing disparity. The crack powder disparity disproportionately affected African Americans, who made up more than 80% of those convicted of federal crack offenses. At a hearing I held in 2009, former Bush administration DEA head Asa Hutchinson, known to many of us as a former colleague in the House, testified, and I quote, "Under the current disparity, the credibility of our entire drug enforcement system is weakened." What was happening? African Americans were noting what was going on here. They were being sent, as Senator Booker said, over to the prison system and put away for years and years for the use of a tiny amount of crack cocaine because of the sentencing guidelines that we established in the House of Representatives. So the Smarter Sentencing Act addresses this issue. I might add that in 2010, I joined with Senator Jeff Sessions, Republican of Alabama, in sponsoring the Fair Sentencing Act. We decided that we would address this issue of the 100-to-1 disparity and try to make sense out of it. I support 1-to-1. I think that's what the science backs. But we reached a political agreement. That's the nature of the Senate and the House. And the bill unanimously passed the Senate and the House, being signed into law by the President. This Fair Sentencing Act reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Now, the Smarter Sentencing Act, the bill that we're considering today, addresses this again. It would allow some inmates who were sentenced before the Fair Sentencing Act to petition for the sentence reductions that this law put in place in 2010. So this provision would not automatically reduce to a single sentence of anyone serving under the old 100-to-1 standard, but it would allow federal judges and prosecutors to conduct a case-by-case, singular individual review as whether the individual should have their sentence reduced. Responding to our decreased reliance on prisons, the Smarter Sentencing Act would direct the Justice Department to report to Congress on how the cost savings from our bill would be used to reduce crime and prevent recidivism. And let's respond to a few misstatements that have been made about the Smarter Sentencing Act. One of our colleagues said, and I quote, "We are not sending huge numbers of nonviolent drug offenders to federal prison under lengthy mandatory minimum sentences." Senator Booker, how would you respond to that comment?
No, I appreciate that, and I hope that we all in the Senate can deal from the same set of facts. We're entitled to different opinions, different conclusions from the facts, but we should not be debating facts when we have them clearly before us. So let's take a look at those facts. In 2011, the Sentencing Commission issued a comprehensive study about the mandatory minimum sentences. The study found that almost 55,000 people were in federal prisons for serving mandatory minimum sentences for a drug crime. That was more than 50% of all federal drug offenders and more than a quarter, 25%, of all federal prisoners, period. Second, the great majority of federal drug offenders do not use violence. Let me say that one more time, because it's very important. We're talking about in this bill nonviolent offenders, and the great majority of federal drug offenders do not use violence. The Sentencing Commission's most recent data show that less than 1% of offenders used or threatened violence in committing their crime, and that no weapons were involved in more than 80% of drug cases. Third, many of those serving mandatory minimum drug sentences are low-level offenders. It is true that certain low-level offenders, like couriers, don't often receive mandatory minimums. But other low-level offenders frequently are sentenced to mandatory minimums. For example, among those who are most likely to receive a mandatory minimum sentence are street-level dealers, those who sell less than 1 ounce of a drug. Almost 45% of street-level dealers are serving mandatory minimums in federal prison. And finally, these mandatory minimum sentences are lengthy. They are costly. They drain taxpayer resources. A Sentencing Commission study showed that the average sentence for mandatory minimums was 132 months, 11 years in federal prison without parole. And so, Senator Lee, some claim also that mandatory minimum prison sentences are not a major factor in the massive increase in the federal prison population and overcrowding in federal prisons. Remember, in the last 30 years, we have had an explosion in our federal prison population, 800%. And some people say that mandatory minimums have had nothing to do with that. I would love for you to respond. Is that true?
It is not true. That is simply inaccurate. So those who insist that our exploding federal prison population somehow has nothing to do with the explosion in use of mandatory minimum prison sentences within the federal system are simply wrong. In its 2011 report, the U.S. Sentencing Commission concluded that mandatory minimums have had, quote, a significant impact on the federal prison population, close quote. From 1995 through 2010, the number of federal prisoners serving a mandatory minimum sentence grew from 29,603 to 75,579. That is a 155% increase, and it represents over 1/3 of all federal prisoners. As of December 2014, over 59% of the 210,567 federal inmates, 125,000 inmates overall, had been convicted of an offense carrying a mandatory minimum. Of these, 73.4%, which represents 91,806 inmates, were required to serve that mandatory minimum sentence or more. In 2013, 62.1% of all drug offenders were convicted of an offense carrying a mandatory minimum. Over 60% of them received no safety valve relief, and 70% of them did not receive relief for cooperating with authorities. Now, some have argued that those serving sentences for nonviolent drug offenses have long and violent criminal histories. But Sentencing Commission data show that this is inaccurate. In 2013, 49.6% of drug offenders had little or no criminal history, and only 7% of drug offenders were sentenced under the career offender sentencing guideline, which requires 2 prior convictions for a drug offense or a crime of violence. But here's the important point. The Smarter Sentencing Act reduces certain mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenses, but we do not lower the maximum sentence. That means a judge can sentence offenders all the way up to the statutory maximum if she determines that it's appropriate under the circumstances. So, Senator Durbin, some have raised concerns about how reducing mandatory minimum sentences might impact serious problems like the heroin epidemic or narco-terrorism. Can you address that?
I want to address that because it's a problem in my state. It's a problem across the United States. We are finding that high school students are turning to heroin. It's affordable. Sadly, it's affordable, and they are using it as an alternative to other drugs. And we certainly know the perils and dangers of narco-terrorism. The Smarter Sentencing Act that we are co-sponsoring only reduces certain mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. Now, there's a separate mandatory minimum of 20 years that applies when the drugs have resulted in death or serious bodily injury, and any dealer who sells drugs that kill or hurt someone, like an accidental overdose, will still be subject to the same mandatory minimum of 20 years. Our bill does not touch that provision of the law. As for narco-terrorism, a special federal sentencing guideline applies. The truth is, charges under that crime, statute rather, are very rare. Between 2008 and 2012, only 3 cases, 3 out of almost 200,000, were sentenced under that guideline. But the Smarter Sentencing Act does not change the sentencing guideline enhancement for narco-terrorism or any of the enhancements for terrorism. We don't cut any corners when it comes to that serious crime. In fact, our bill directs the Sentencing Commission to ensure that severe sentences for, quote, violent, repeat, and serious drug traffickers who present public safety risks remain in place, end of quote. Also, there will continue to be dozens of statutory penalties and sentence enhancements in the sentencing guidelines, allowing judges to impose heightened sentences for violent and repeat offenders. The Smarter Sentencing Act, which we're describing, doesn't automatically reduce a single sentence, and it doesn't eliminate any mandatory minimum or reduce any maximum sentence at all. Our bill simply restores the traditional authority of a federal judge to impose a sentence that fits the crime and the criminal, based on the circumstances of the case, maintaining a floor below which no judge can be sentenced. No person can be sentenced. Senator Booker, can you discuss the impact the Smarter Sentencing Act will have on communities that have been the most negatively impacted by the crisis in our criminal justice system?
Senator Durbin, I appreciate that question because this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the legislation originally introduced by Senator Lee and yourself, because the mandatory minimums is patently unfair to people all across America, whether you're white or black, to have a disproportionate sentence unnecessary to punish you and prevent you from doing future nonviolent crime is bad enough. But when this is, as we were talking before, so negatively concentrated in certain urban areas, it creates a pervasive belief that begins to undermine faith in our criminal justice system alone. As we said earlier, the overwhelming majority of drug users and sellers are white, but the overwhelming majority of people incarcerated and arrested for it are black, as well as those receiving mandatory minimums. But this, what people have to understand, has a punishing effect on us all. Number one, it is hurting families. A friend of mine brought to my attention a Sesame Street clip that even the educators in public broadcasting are seeing that certain communities have so many of their men, nonviolent offenders, being sucked into the prison system for these long sentences that we're creating a generation of children growing up without their parents. And that has a difficult impact when it comes to the poverty of that family, when it becomes to the challenges of having a provider pulled away. And so the Smarter Sentencing Act is something to help to relieve that problem, but also the cost to us all. Because what's wonderful at this time that we have a debt and we need to invest in infrastructure and many things, this system is costing us hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And your legislation, this legislation that I have signed on as a co-sponsor, has a savings that can be redirected to community efforts that prevent crime in the first place, evidence-based programs that undermine crime in the first place, and also help people coming out of prison staying out of prison. We can save money and still protect public safety with lower rates of incarceration and a greater reliance on community supervision and treatment. And the wonderful thing about this is what I'm saying here is not speculation. It is the facts that we're experiencing in states that have already embraced reducing mandatory minimums. In fact, many of these states, and this is wonderful why this is a bipartisan legislation, many of these states are red states. We're seeing this path of reducing crime, reducing prison populations, creating savings, being shown to us in state after state model that the federal government should follow. Models seen in Texas and Georgia. And so I would like to ask Senator Flake, he encouraged us to pay attention to the overcriminalization in the federal system as well. You too are a champion of reforming the system and making it better. I want to ask you, how does the Smarter Sentencing Act address the problem of overcriminalization as you see it, sir?
Well, thank you, Senator Booker. Thank you, Senator Durbin, Senator Lee. It's great to be part of this bipartisan effort at Smarter Sentencing. This is important because this section, or one section of the bill, requires the Attorney General and the heads of certain federal agencies to each submit a public report that identifies all criminal offenses that are established by statute or regulation that each agency enforces. And these reports must provide information on the elements of each offense, the potential penalty, and the required intent for each offense, and the number of prosecutions for each offense for the last 15 years. This is valuable information. This section also requires the Attorney General and the relevant agencies to establish a publicly accessible index for these offenses. This information is an important step toward understanding the scope of the over-criminalization problem. When we have this information, we'll have a better idea at why these sentences are being imposed, and we can make better recommendations moving ahead. Now, there are some who argue that the long mandatory sentences, these prison sentences, encourage defendants to plead guilty and to cooperate with prosecutors. They claim that by reducing mandatory minimum sentences, that our bill will reduce the incentive for defendants to plead guilty and thus cooperate. Now, Senator Lee, how would you respond to that claim?
Those who make that argument, those that suggest that by passing this bill we would reduce the bargaining power of prosecutors are mistaken. The Sentencing Commission data on this point show that the longer a mandatory minimum sentence is, the more likely a defendant is not to plead guilty and to cooperate instead to insist on going to trial. Sentencing Commission data also show that rates of cooperation for crimes that have no mandatory minimum sentence are the same and even higher than for drugs that do have rigid mandatory minimum sentences. The reality is that defendants are most likely to cooperate when they have information to give. That's why high-level drug offenders receive relief from mandatory minimum sentences at much higher rates than lower-level offenders. Defendants who organize or manage a drug trafficking enterprise have the most information with which to bargain as they enter into discussions with prosecutors. Low-level offenders who have less responsibility and less knowledge often don't have much information to offer, no matter how long a mandatory minimum sentence they might face in the particular case. Now, Judge William Wilkins, who was appointed to the bench by President Reagan and served as the first chair of the U.S. Sentencing Commission, said the following on this topic. He said, quote, "There are few federal judges engaged in criminal sentencing who have not had the disheartening experience of seeing major players in crimes before them immunize themselves from the mandatory minimum sentences by blowing the whistle on their minors, while the low-level offenders find themselves sentenced to the mandatory minimum prison term so skillfully avoided by the kingpins," close quote. Now, some claim that the Smarter Sentencing Act will add up to $1 billion in federal spending. Senator Flake, is that true?
You know, that is creative accounting, to put it mildly. You know, here it is in reality. The Congressional Budget Office has taken a look at this and looked at the impact of passing the Smarter Sentencing Act. It's true that there will be cost incurred, and that's mainly because of benefits that are paid to people who are not in prison any longer or for so long. But the CBO estimated that in the first 10 years alone, our bill would save approximately $4 billion for a net savings of about $3 billion. Those savings can be redirected to efforts to reduce crime and to reduce and prevent crime in the first place. Senator Booker, I think it's probably partly because of this reason, the cost savings, that we have such broad support for the bill. Do you want to discuss some of the groups that are supporting this legislation?
It gives me a lot of pride to see this incredible convergence from people from all different stripes in our country, all different backgrounds, races, religions, political philosophy. And so let's just start with the bipartisan U.S. Sentencing Commission. The bipartisan U.S. Sentencing Commission and the Judicial Conference have both urged Congress to reduce mandatory minimum penalties, and both have stated their support for this legislation, the Smarter Sentencing Act. It is supported by faith leaders like the Justice Fellowship and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It is supported by advocacy groups across the spectrum and has been endorsed by conservative leaders like Grover Norquist and the Americans for Tax Reform, Eli Lehrer and the R Street Institute, Pat Nolan, former president of Justice Fellowship, Mark Levin of the Texas Public Policy Institute, and Freedom Works. It is supported by law enforcement leaders, including the Major Cities Chiefs Association and the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, which represents many of the largest district attorney offices in the country, big cities. They represent county, federal, state, and local prosecutors at every level. The bill is supported by the Council of Prison Locals, which represents more than 28,000 correctional workers themselves who work in Federal Bureau of Prisons. The bill is also supported by crime victims themselves, including the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, a coalition of more than 1,000 organizations that advocate on behalf of victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. As they explain, mandatory minimum drug sentences are draining the resources needed for victims. And women who are victims of domestic violence sometimes end up serving long sentences Congress intended for kingpins and other drug organizations. All of that unity in this country supporting this act. Senator Lee, I wonder, is there anything else you'd like to say about this bipartisan, widely supported by both the data and the advocates across the political spectrum? Is there anything else you would like to add?
Yes, and I'd like to conclude my remarks in a moment by wrapping up. Before I do that, though, I notice on the floor with us today is my friend Senator Whitehouse, who happens to be another supporter of this bill, another co-sponsor, and who is also the ranking member on the Crime Subcommittee in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And before I wrap up, I wonder if my friend Senator Whitehouse would like to say a few words about this bill.
Thank you, Senator Lee. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. I share the concern that we all have for a federal prison system that is 30% over capacity and costs $6 billion a year already. You have to add, if you're going to take care of the 30% over capacity, that's $6 billion under the present circumstances. And that $6 billion comes out of law enforcement budgets and community support budgets that could be making our streets safer. Mr. President, at the beginning of every sentence, a judge imposes the duration of the sentence, and at the end of every sentence, a prisoner makes a decision about how he or she is going to engage with the public upon their release. There is a bill that deals with the latter part, that helps to support prisoners to make better decisions and be better prepared to re-engage with the public once they are released. And I hope very much that that bill, which Senator Cornyn and I are leading in the Senate Judiciary Committee, can, as this moves forward, be connected, because the two are linked. They're linked thematically, and it makes a big difference. The reason you care about how people at the end get back into regular society is because if they reoffend, they go back into the prison again and add to the prison population and add to the cost. And if they're in longer than they should be, then you're not getting any public safety benefit out of all of this. So I look very forward to working with all of my colleagues to try to see if we can get together in the Senate a comprehensive piece of sentencing reform legislation. Having been a prosecutor myself, having used mandatory minimums, I appreciate that they can, in certain circumstances, have value. But I think if you look at the big picture, this sentencing reform legislation is important and will serve the public interest in a great variety of respects, including safer communities. So that's why I'm a co-sponsor of it, and that's why I'm an ardent supporter of it. And let me thank, in closing, Senator Durbin and Senator Lee for their leadership as the lead co-authors of this legislation, and Senator Flake and Senator Booker for their advocacy on its behalf as fellow co-sponsors.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Mr. President, I'd like to conclude by thanking my colleagues for their help in this effort. First of all, thank you to Senator Durbin for working with me over the last couple of years in developing this legislation. I thank my other co-sponsors as well. I thank Senator Booker, Senator Whitehouse, and Senator Flake, who have joined us in this discussion today. The Smarter Sentencing Act, Mr. President, is a truly bipartisan, bicameral effort that brings support from across the political spectrum. Excessive mandatory minimums do not make us safer. The last 30 years have shown us that they're applied unevenly and that they leave a gaping hole in the communities they impact most heavily. Now, we as a society have to pick up the tab. We must decide if we will continue to pay the high fiscal cost and the high social costs that mandatory minimums impose. It's important for us to remember that these costs do have many manifestations. Sometimes in this body, sometimes in this town, we tend to focus only on the fiscal price tag, only on the price tag that can be expressed in raw numbers. But doing that allows us to ignore too often the high human costs, the families, the communities that have lost brothers and sons and fathers and uncles and nephews, people who could be back in their communities contributing meaningfully to their success, who are instead sent away for sometimes far too long of a prison sentence. We can continue down that current path, or if we would rather try something smarter, perhaps that would be better. The Smarter Sentencing Act gives us an opportunity to do precisely that, to do something smarter, to rely less on prison and to do more with scarce resources. Instead of just paying for prisons, it would allow us to work smarter in pursuit of justice. I hope all my colleagues will join us in supporting the Smarter Sentencing Act. Thank you, Mr. President.